He crossed the border believing he would have legal work in the United States. But when he got off the bus, they took away his documents and locked him in a house. For months, he worked like an invisible slave until, in silence, he whispered his pain to a stranger. The call he made that rainy night not only saved his life, but opened doors to a freedom he never imagined having. Eduardo was 22 when he left Chiapas. It wasn't an impulsive decision or an adventure. It was hunger. Real hunger. Hunger for food, for opportunities, for something more than dry land and broken promises. Since he was 15, he had worked at whatever he could, harvesting coffee, loading boxes at the market, helping a town mechanic. But nothing was enough. His mother, Lydia, had been washing other people's clothes for as long as he could remember. His father had died 5 years ago, and all he left behind was an old wooden violin that rested, covered in dust, in the corner of the living room. If you like interesting stories, hit like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. We'd love to hear from you. The agency arrived like a light through the fog, a small office hidden behind a lunch counter with a sign that said, International Migration Solutions. They promised legal employment in the United States, with a work visa, health insurance, shared housing, and a decent salary. What caught Eduardo's attention most was how they spoke, with confidence, as if everything was really already set up. You just need to pay for the processing, young man. We'll take care of the rest, they told him. He sold the bicycle he used to get to work. He sold the old TV that barely turned on. And with tears in his eyes, he pawned his father's violin. He didn't want to do it. His mother didn't want him to do it. But it was either that or keep watching the refrigerator get emptier and emptier. The morning of his departure, Chiapas dawned with a warm breeze. Eduardo carried a worn backpack, a shirt his mother had lovingly ironed, and the only pair of shoes he owned. His mother hugged him so tight that for a moment he thought she wouldn't let go. "Don't bring me gifts, son. Just come back alive," she whispered, slipping a small white cloth rosary, almost threadbare from time, into his pocket. "I'll be okay, Mom. I'll call you from there soon," he promised, never imagining that call wouldn't come so quickly. The journey was long, first by bus to Ciudad Juarez. Then, after waiting several days in a hostel with other migrants, a man, who called himself Lawyer Ramirez, though no one had seen him with any official papers, handed him a yellow envelope with what he claimed was a temporary tourist visa. He explained that he just had to say he was coming on vacation and that once in Houston, they would pick him up to take him to work on a farm that always needed hands. Eduardo didn't like to lie, but years of hunger pushed him to do things he never thought he would do. When the plane landed in Houston, he felt something like hope for the first time. The airport was huge, and English voices surrounded him like a language he knew he would soon have to understand. He passed through immigration nervously, but everything went well. No one suspected. Outside, the heat was dense, heavy, different from Chiapas. 2 men were waiting for him with a sign bearing his name. They smiled. They greeted him with pats on the back and quick words. They weren't gringos, they were Latinos. One of them had an accent similar to his. Eduardo felt calm. They put him in an old pickup truck with dark windows and norteño music blasting. While driving, they offered him water, told him how much he would earn, how easy everything was. He looked out the window at the clean streets, the shiny cars, the lined trees. It didn't seem real. After almost an hour, they entered a remote neighborhood where houses were more run down, some with broken fences, others with windows covered by sheets. Finally, they stopped in front of a gray wooden house with overgrown grass and a rusty bicycle lying at the entrance. "Here we are," said one, taking down his things. Eduardo entered. The house smelled of dampness and confinement. The walls were yellow with nicotine. There were other boys, all quiet, all with downcast eyes. They assigned him a mattress on the floor, next to a window that didn't open. "Your passport for security," they told him. He hesitated but handed it over. "We start tomorrow. You'll see that things will go well for you." They closed the door. He put his backpack to one side and sat down. The silence was thick. The voices of other young men were muffled murmurs. No one spoke loudly. No one asked anything. That night, Eduardo didn't sleep. His mother's rosary was in his hand, clutched tight. He felt a cold in his stomach that didn't come from the weather. He didn't know that this would be the beginning of a prison without bars, where hunger was no longer for food, but for freedom. The next morning began without sun. The light coming through the window seemed diluted, as if the city also knew that something wasn't right inside. Eduardo woke up with a stiff back from sleeping on the floor, surrounded by old mattresses and sleeping bodies. No one spoke, no one greeted, only some eyes crossed brief, tired glances, as if everyone shared the same thought: don't ask, don't speak, don't trust. Shortly after 7, one of the men who had brought him the night before entered the house without knocking. He had a list in his hand and shouted names. Eduardo was the third to be named. They told him to put on the same clothes from yesterday and take what he needed, but no backpacks or papers. "Today, you're going to learn how to earn your bread here, buddy," the man told him with a crooked smile. They got into a white truck, no logos, where 7 other young men were already sitting. During the drive, which lasted almost an hour, no one said a word. Eduardo looked out the window, trying to memorize the route, but the streets looked too similar. He found it hard to know if they were going north, south, or nowhere. They arrived at an industrial area behind a Chinese restaurant. There they were taken down and separated into groups. Eduardo was given a mop, a bucket with dirty water, and shown the back entrance. The whole floor, bathrooms too, don't ask, don't stop. That was his first day, and the second, and the third. Sometimes he cleaned kitchens, sometimes patios full of garbage. Other times they took him to construction houses where he had to carry cement bags, sand walls, paint without gloves or protection. He never knew where he would go. They never gave him directions. They always picked him up and returned him to the same grey house. The nights were worse. When he arrived, he barely ate some reheated rice or cold beans that he shared with the others. No one used phones. No one had money. No one had their passport. One night, Eduardo dared to ask one of the boys, "When are they going to give us the papers?" The other, a thin Honduran with sunken eyes, looked at him as if he had just woken from a dream. "Papers? No one's going to give you anything here, brother. We're already in, aren't we? Now, just endure." Eduardo didn't understand. According to the agency, everything was legal. According to the men who brought him, it was just a matter of waiting a few weeks. But weeks passed, then a month, then 2. The money they said he was earning, he never saw in full. "This is for rent," they said. "This for food. This for the papers being processed." And if anyone ever complained, the answer was the same. "You're illegal, man. If you leave, we call ICE. You want to get deported?" That phrase became a constant threat. No one dared to escape. Some had already tried. One was forcibly returned. Another disappeared and was never heard from again. One night, while Eduardo was cleaning a closed restaurant, he heard one of the supervisors tell another, "That kid is good. Who hired him?" "He's not hired, he's on loan," the other replied with a dry laugh. That day, Eduardo understood that he wasn't an employee. He was something closer to an object, a tool. He began to fear everything. Fear of sirens he heard through the window. Fear that his mother thought he had forgotten her. Fear of forgetting how his name sounded in a real conversation, without yells, without orders. He only had one thing that kept him going, the rosary his mother had given him. He carried it in his pocket every day. Sometimes he'd take it out in the bathroom, clutch it tightly and murmur a prayer, not knowing if it was heard by anyone. One early morning, while trying to sleep on the damp mattress, he heard one of the young men crying silently. No one comforted him. Everyone pretended not to hear. Because if one started, the others could break too. and no one there could afford to break. One day, something different happened. He was assigned to clean a church on the south side of the city. It was Sunday. Eduardo arrived in his dirty uniform and dim eyes. While mopping a hallway near the altar, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned slowly. It was a woman with white hair, a firm face, and a penetrating gaze. She observed him in silence. Then with a soft voice, she asked, "What's your name?" Eduardo hesitated. He was trained not to speak, not to say anything. But this woman didn't have the face of the captors. She had something different, something like compassion. "Eduardo," he whispered. She nodded, and without saying more, she discreetly slipped a small piece of paper into his pants pocket. Then she walked away without looking back. When Eduardo read it, his heart raced. The paper said, "If you trust me, call me, Marta," and below a number written in blue ink. That small paper at that moment was worth more than any bill he had ever seen. Eduardo kept the paper like gold. That night, as soon as he returned to the grey house, he waited for everyone to fall asleep, and with extreme care took the folded note from his pocket. He opened it slowly, as if it could break with a breath. There it still was, the name Marta and a number, handwritten digits with firm but warm handwriting. He read it over and over. He didn't dare memorize it for fear of forgetting it, and he didn't want to leave it in sight in case someone else found it. During the following days, Eduardo became a mix of anxiety and hope. He continued working as before, cleaning kitchens at odd hours, carrying construction materials under the scorching sun, picking up trash in abandoned house yards. All without a contract, without protection, without a voice. But there was something different in his gaze, something his captors began to notice. "What's wrong with you?" one of them asked, while watching him from the back door of a restaurant. "You're acting weird, quieter than usual." Eduardo lowered his head. "I'm just tired." It was true. He was tired, but not in body. He was exhausted in soul. From pretending everything was fine, from accepting that his life was worthless, and most of all from watching himself lose more of himself day by day. One of the most humiliating jobs they assigned him was at a house in North Houston. A wealthy family had hired renovations, but the construction supervisor subcontracted the same men who exploited Eduardo. There, under the roof of a white mansion with huge columns, Eduardo worked 10 hours a day without stopping. He painted walls, picked up debris, washed tools, and at the end was forced to clean the bathrooms of the legitimate workers. All this while, the real contractors joked, ate well, and received their full pay. At the end of the day, they gave him $40, but he could only keep 10. The rest, they said, was for the debt he still owed. A debt that never ended. "You're here thanks to us," they constantly reminded him. "If it weren't for the agency, you'd still be eating dirt in Chiapas, so you better be grateful, bastard." Eduardo wanted to scream. He wanted to tell the truth. But every time he got close to someone outside the circle, fear paralyzed him. Just thinking that ice might catch him made him break out in cold sweat. He imagined his mother receiving a call from the border, crying, unable to do anything. And that forced him to stay quiet again and again. But then came the image of Marta, of her serene eyes, of the way she slipped him the paper without saying another word. Who was she really? Why would she trust him? What if it was a trap? In one of those early mornings, after returning soaked in sweat and with hands full of sores, Eduardo locked himself in the bathroom of the house and with the small paper in his hands, looked at himself in the mirror. His face was dirty, his eyes sunken, and an irregular beard that added years to him. He didn't recognize himself. He was no longer the young man from Chiapas who dreamed of sending money to his mother. He was someone else, someone who had learned to survive in silence. In a low voice, almost inaudible, he spoke to himself. "What if Marta is my way out?" But an inner voice stopped him again. What if someone else discovered? What if they found out he had a contact outside? That week, one of the boys from the house disappeared. No one said anything, but everyone noticed. His mattress was removed. His clothes were piled in a garbage bag. Eduardo didn't know if he had been deported, if he had escaped, or if something worse had happened to him. And that made the fear return with more force. One night, during a job at a clandestine bakery, a customer, a Latino man, older, with a Caribbean accent, approached him and asked, "So you, young man, where are you from?" Eduardo looked at him in silence. He didn't know what to say, but the man insisted with a kind smile. "You look very young. Everything okay?" Eduardo swallowed. He opened his mouth, but instead of speaking, he lowered his head and continued cleaning the floor. He couldn't. Not yet. After that encounter, something broke inside him. He realized he couldn't go on like this, that if he didn't do something, he would end up like his companion's empty mattress, forgotten. He returned home that night with feet full of blisters. The supervisor was in a bad mood. He was yelling more than usual. He forbade them from even going out to the patio. "Too much immigration movement," he said. Eduardo locked himself in the small back room. He took out his mother's rosary, pressed it tight against his chest, and for the first time in months, he cried. Not from physical pain. He cried from shame, from feeling invisible, from having swallowed so many times the urge to scream, to tell, to ask for help. Silence was his chain, but the memory of Marta was the key. And in that instant, Eduardo knew something with a clarity that chilled his blood and at the same time lit up his soul. He couldn't stay quiet forever. The days melted into each other as if time had stopped moving forward. Eduardo no longer knew if it was Tuesday or Sunday, if it was cold or hot outside. He only knew that his body hurt and his soul was getting smaller and smaller. The only thing he still kept with him, besides the paper with Marta's number, was his mother's rosary, that little piece of white cloth he carried in his pocket like a shield. He slept on the floor, on a thin mattress that reeked of dampness. His back would curve during the night, and when he woke up he felt muscles stiff like old wood. The air inside the house was dense, without ventilation. Sometimes one of the fans would spin, but with a hum that sounded like the lament of a sick animal. No one said anything. No one complained, because there, complaining was a dangerous luxury. When they went out to work, they were crammed in the back of trucks without plates, without seatbelts, without a fixed destination. Days would start before dawn and end long after the sun had set. Sometimes they'd go hours without a bite to eat. Sometimes they'd be given a bag with stale bread and a bottle of warm water, and even then no one rebelled. Fear was stronger than hunger. Every time a patrol passed, Eduardo felt his heart stop. He would freeze, lower his gaze. He feared someone would look at him directly and ask just one question. Any question, because he wouldn't know what to say, because he knew that any wrong word could destroy everything. The city of Houston, with its lights, clean streets, and tall buildings, seemed like a distant postcard seen through a dirty window. Eduardo observed it during trips between jobs, from the truck or from some basement where he mopped floors. But he never touched it. He was like a ghost within that city, present but invisible. One night, after a 16-hour day fixing the roof of a dilapidated house, Eduardo arrived at the dwelling where he slept and collapsed on the mattress. He couldn't take it anymore. His back was full of bruises, his fingers cut by rusty metal, his shoulders burning. He felt his body no longer responded, as if he had suddenly become an empty shell. He stared at the ceiling for hours, eyes open, lips dry, and he thought of his mother, of her hands washing clothes in the river, of the voice that told him as a child, "Poverty doesn't take away your courage, son. It just hides it a little." But there, at that moment, Eduardo found no courage in himself. He felt dirty, used, disposable, as if he was worth nothing anymore. As if the only thing that mattered about him were his strong arms and his silence. He thought for the first time in months about the possibility of letting go, of not fighting anymore. He closed his eyes. He imagined his mother's crying face, the Chiapas countryside, the smell of coffee in the mornings, his father's violin playing in the living room. Everything seemed so distant, so unrecoverable. But just when he was about to give up, his hand brushed the rosary. He clenched his fingers. He felt the knots in the thread, the small worn crucifix, and something inside him lit up. A tiny thread of strength, of anger perhaps, of love too. He sat up slowly. He took out the paper with Marta's number and read it again. 10, 15 times. He held it against his chest as if he could hear her voice from the other side. He still didn't have the strength to call her, but he no longer felt just fear. He felt something more, an urgent need to change, to live, to be someone again. That week, one of the companions he worked with had an accident. He fell from an improperly placed ladder while painting the exterior of a restaurant. He hit his head. He bled. Eduardo screamed, tried to help him, called for an ambulance, but one of the men in charge of the group stopped him short. "Nobody calls anyone. We're not legal. You want immigration to come," he yelled furiously. Instead of medical attention, they put him in a truck and left him at the house in one of the rooms. The boy, a 19-year-old Salvadoran, spent the night with his head bandaged with an old towel. He vomited twice. Eduardo took care of him as best he could, giving him water and keeping him awake. The next day he didn't get up anymore, and no one spoke of him again. It was at that moment that Eduardo understood everything. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty. He wasn't a worker, he was a slave. That word, slave, burned inside him. It made him see his reality with different eyes. They had stolen everything from him, his documents, his freedom, his dignity, and the most dangerous thing of all, his voice. But something still remained, his decision. That night, while rain began to hit the tin roof of the house, Eduardo sat on the floor next to the closed window and repeated in a low voice, "If I'm still alive tomorrow, I'm going to call her." And for the first time in a long time, that promise gave him peace. Sunday arrived as if the sky knew something was about to change. Clouds covered the sun, but it wasn't raining. The air was thick, humid, as if holding its breath. Eduardo was awakened at dawn, as always, with a light kick to the mattress and the dry order from one of the captors. "Get dressed, you're going to the church today." The church. Eduardo immediately remembered Marta's face. It was the only reason he hadn't completely collapsed. He had spent days reviewing her face in his mind, her perfectly combed white hair, her unafraid eyes, her calm voice, without judgment. They left in the same truck as always. Eduardo carried nothing with him except his rosary, the paper with the number, and a racing heart. He was going to return to the same place where that woman had extended her hand without asking questions. During the journey, he observed every street, every sign, trying to memorize the route. It was no longer just out of curiosity. It was for survival. The church was simple, brick facade, a metal cross, and a sign that read San Marcos Mission. Outside, a few families gathered for morning mass. Children ran through the parking lot, ladies placed flower arrangements, and older men greeted with sincere smiles. It was another world, one that Eduardo didn't feel he belonged to, but longed for more than he dared to admit. "You handle the hallway and back bathrooms." "No talking to anyone," said one of the men before disappearing through the back. Eduardo nodded without looking. He took the mop and bucket and began his work in silence. Every corner he cleaned seemed to give back a little of himself, not for the work itself, but for the environment, for the energy of the place. There were no yells, no threats. For the first time in a long time, he felt his steps weren't being watched. He passed by a small prayer room. He stopped for a few seconds. He looked inside. It was empty, with lit candles and polished wooden pews. He entered slowly, as if afraid of breaking something sacred. He knelt without thinking. He didn't pray. He just closed his eyes and let the silence envelop him. "You're not alone." The voice made him turn. There she was, Marta, standing in the doorway, with her hands crossed over her lap and the same firm but warm expression. Eduardo was speechless. He felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to say so many things, but none came out. "You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to," she said, approaching. "Just tell me if you're still in the same place." He nodded, lowering his gaze. Marta reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook. She wrote something and handed it to him. "Take this. If you can call someday, do it from a safe place. Someone will answer. Just say, 'I'm Eduardo.' Nothing more." He took the notebook with trembling hands. His fingers brushed hers, and in that instant, something inside him broke. He didn't cry. Not yet. But for the first time in months, he felt someone saw him. Not as a worker, not as an illegal, not as just another number. As a person. Marta didn't ask anything more. She just nodded, as if confirming she understood everything without the need for words. Then she left the room and left him alone. Eduardo stayed there a few more minutes. He looked at the altar, the ceiling, the candles. Everything was so simple, and at the same time, so powerful. He finished his shift and returned to the truck. One of the captors was waiting with an annoyed face. "What took you so long?" he asked. "I had to clean a bathroom with vomit twice," Eduardo replied without blinking. The man snorted and got in the vehicle. Eduardo did too. In his pocket, the notebook with the number was safe. His heart was beating hard, but for the first time, it wasn't from fear. It was from decision. That night, the house was tenser than usual. One of the boys had tried to escape days before, and the bosses were nervous. They put double locks on the front door and prohibited use of the back bathroom after 9. Eduardo barely ate. He lay on his mattress and pretended to sleep. He waited until silence covered everything, until the others' snoring filled the air. Then, with his heart in his throat, he slowly crawled toward the back window. It was nailed shut, but days ago he had loosened one nail without anyone noticing. Carefully, he pulled it out completely. He opened it just enough to fit his body through. He got out. The night was cold. It was starting to rain. Eduardo felt the humidity on his skin, but he didn't care. He ran through dark streets, crossed 2 avenues, hid in bushes when he saw a patrol. He walked 2 more blocks until he reached a 24-hour convenience store. He entered soaked, trembling. The clerk looked at him sideways. Eduardo said nothing. He went straight to the public phone in the corner of the store. He dialed the number from the notebook. 1 ring, 2, 3. "Hello," answered a woman's voice. Eduardo swallowed. Words refused to come out. His lips trembled, but finally, in a thread of a voice, he murmured, "It's me, Eduardo." And then he broke down in tears. If you're enjoying this story, hit like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay up to date with all our content. "Where are you, Eduardo?" asked the voice on the other end of the phone. It wasn't Marta, but her tone had the same kind of calm, one that doesn't scare, doesn't pressure, but rather holds. Eduardo looked around. The fogged glass of the convenience store only let shadows show outside. Rain fell without rest. His clothes dripped water and fear. A store. On the corner, "I think it's Wirt and Longpoint, and there's a sign that says El Sol Market," he babbled. "Very good. Don't move. Someone will come for you. Stay inside, okay?" "Yes," he responded in a low, broken voice. He hung up. He huddled next to the candy machine, trembling. He didn't know if it was from cold, adrenaline, or the certainty that after that call, there was no turning back. What he had done could save his life, or ruin it completely. But he had no choice. He had crossed the line. He had spoken. The young cashier looked at him occasionally without intervening. At first he seemed uncomfortable, later just curious. Maybe he knew, maybe he had already seen others like Eduardo, invisible, lost, searching for oxygen. 30 minutes passed, then 40. The clock seemed to move slower than ever. Every time the store door opened, Eduardo held his breath. But it was just occasional customers buying cigarettes, beer, or sweet bread until she arrived. Marta. She entered soaked with a dark blue raincoat and a bag in her hand. She saw him immediately. Eduardo stood up with reddened eyes. She didn't smile. She just walked toward him and handed him the bag. Dry clothes. Come with me. He followed her without saying a word. They got into a grey car parked right in front of the store. An older man was in the driver's seat. He greeted with a brief nod and started without asking anything. Eduardo remained silent, looking out the window at the water falling heavily on the city. It seemed like the entire sky was crying with him. "We're going to take you to a safe place. You don't have to worry about anything tonight," said Marta without turning. "You did well." He nodded. He could barely believe it. For the first time in months he was outside, without surveillance, without orders, without yells. He was free, at least for now. They arrived at a simple house with a front yard and warm light in the windows. It wasn't big or luxurious, but it smelled clean, like home. Marta indicated for him to enter. A woman waited inside with a blanket, a cup of hot coffee, and a smile. "Sit down, son. You're safe here." Eduardo sat on the couch, still trembling. The blanket seemed like the softest thing he had touched in weeks. He took the cup with both hands and let the warmth bring back a bit of life. "What's going to happen to me now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Tomorrow we'll talk with lawyers from an organization that helps trafficking victims," Marta responded. "We're not going to leave you alone, Eduardo." He said nothing. He just lowered his head. The word victim sounded strange to him. He didn't feel that way. He felt dirty, stupid, guilty, as if everything he had lived through was his fault for trusting, for being naive. But he couldn't deny what he was, a young man who had everything taken from him and who, even so, had decided to fight for the little he had left. He slept in a real bed that night, with clean sheets, in a room with a window. He cried, not from sadness, but from relief. His body began to relax, to release a tension he didn't even know he was carrying. That night, sleep was deep, without nightmares, without jolts. The next day, 2 people arrived at the house. A Mexican lawyer named Teresa and a social worker named Miguel. Eduardo listened carefully as they explained there was a legal path to stay in the country, the T visa, designed for people who had been victims of human trafficking or labor exploitation. "But I need your testimony, Eduardo, your story, everything you remember," said Teresa with a firm but gentle voice. Eduardo hesitated, not from fear, but because he didn't know where to start. There were so many things, so many days, so many silences, so many humiliations. "We're going to accompany you every step of the way, but this time you'll have control," added Miguel. That's what convinced him. Having control. After so much time being a puppet, those words gave back something he thought was lost. Dignity. He began to talk, little by little, with pauses, full of shame at first. But each sentence he said seemed to lift a weight from his chest. He told everything, from the agency in Chiapas, the trip, the men who received him, the house, the forced labor, the threats. He remembered names, streets, accents. Teresa noted every detail with patience. Miguel offered him water. Marta didn't move from his side. When he finished, silence settled in the room. No one spoke for a few seconds. "You've survived hell, Eduardo," Marta finally said. "But now another fight begins. This time you won't be alone." Eduardo took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he felt he had a future, not a distant dream, a real future. And while outside the rain finally began to stop, he understood that that night in the downpour had not been the end. It had been the beginning of something he never imagined possible: freedom. Eduardo didn't know how he felt. He woke up without fear, but also without certainties. The house where they had taken him in was in a modest Houston neighborhood, with yards without fences and tall trees covering sidewalks with shade. There were no locks on the doors, no yells. He could get up whenever he wanted. He could go to the bathroom without asking permission. He could breathe. But freedom, after confinement, doesn't always arrive like an explosion. Sometimes it comes like a whisper, and Eduardo still didn't know how to move within that whisper. That morning, Marta prepared eggs with tortillas and coffee with thick milk, like what he drank in Chiapas. She didn't ask how he had slept. She didn't ask him to talk. She just served breakfast and sat across from him, reading the newspaper. "Do you like it with sugar?" she asked, pointing to the coffee. Eduardo nodded, shy. She passed him the sugar bowl. That simple domestic gesture moved him. It made him feel part of something, even if just for a second. After breakfast, Miguel, the social worker, arrived. He carried a backpack with documents, forms, brochures. He sat with him in the living room and, without beating around the bush, explained what was coming. "Your captors are not locatable right now. When you returned to the house that night, they had already left. It seems someone warned them that one of you had escaped. They found no one. The house was empty when police arrived." Eduardo lowered his head. For a moment he felt a stab of disappointment. He had dreamed in silence of seeing them arrested, of someone making them pay for everything they had done to him. "Don't worry about that," Miguel added, as if reading his thoughts. "The focus now is you, for you to recover, for you to rebuild." That verb, rebuild, sounded enormous to him, as if he were a collapsed building that had to be erected from the foundations. "It will take time, Eduardo, but the important thing is you're not alone." Teresa, the lawyer, arrived shortly after. She explained the process for applying for the T visa. They would have to document everything: dates, places, names, even details he had forgotten or blocked. Everything would help. They would also have to gather support letters, medical evidence if any, psychological reports. "It's a slow road. It can take more than a year," she warned. "But there's hope. You have a solid case." Eduardo nodded. He no longer expected things to be quick. Nothing in his life had been like that, but for the first time, he felt that the time passing wasn't a punishment. It was a process, a transition. During the following days, he settled into a small room within a shelter managed by a local NGO. He shared space with other migrants, but was no longer watched. There were rules, but also respect. There were routines, but also options. A psychologist saw him twice a week. At first, he barely spoke. He didn't know how to put into words everything he had lived through. But the therapist didn't get desperate. She told him silence was also a way of telling. "Your body has spoken for months. Now it's your voice's turn," she told him once. Little by little, Eduardo began to write in a notebook. It wasn't a diary, not exactly. They were loose sentences, memories, sensations, sometimes drawings, sometimes prayers that came from his childhood. "We are not what they did to us. We are what we choose to be after." That was one of the first sentences he wrote. No one had taught him that. It just sprouted. Marta visited him every week. She always brought something: sweet bread, a new t-shirt, a letter from his mother. That was one of the hardest and most beautiful things, reconnecting with Lydia. When Marta told him they had located his mother with help from a contact in Mexico, Eduardo was speechless. Later, when he read her letter, written with tight handwriting and trembling lines, he cried like a child. "I'm waiting for you. It doesn't matter how long it takes. I'm still here, my son, praying with that rosary that's half yours and half mine." Eduardo responded immediately. He wrote from the heart, hiding nothing. He asked for forgiveness. He promised to return someday. He told her he was alive, that he was fighting, and that, for his mother, was all that mattered. While the legal process advanced, life also began to move within him. A shelter worker offered to help in the kitchen, and he accepted. It wasn't much, but it gave him back a routine, a purpose. "You have a good hand with beans," a Salvadoran woman told him, laughing. "My mom taught me," Eduardo replied, smiling for the first time in a long time. One day, at a shelter meeting, he met another young man who had gone through something similar. They talked for hours. They shared stories. And Eduardo felt for the first time that his pain wasn't unique, that he wasn't alone in that wound, but he also understood that his story wasn't just his own, that it could serve, that it could help others. And that's how an idea was born, a seed that began to germinate in his mind. What if his voice could save someone else? The paperwork seemed endless. Forms with codes Eduardo didn't understand. Questions that forced him to relive painful moments, certificates, sworn statements. Each document he filled out was like an open wound that had to be cleaned with precision, without rushing. Teresa, the lawyer, explained each step with patience, but also with firmness. The T-visa is a powerful tool, Eduardo, but it's not automatic. The system isn't made for people like you. It's made to distrust. He understood. He was no longer surprised by the obstacles, the conditions, the requirements. What cost him most wasn't the wait, but the uncertainty. In each letter that arrived, his heart stopped. Each envelope from the federal government could be a light or a condemnation. Miguel, the social worker, helped him gather evidence. They looked for records from the hospital where they had treated the companion who fell from the roof, the one who never got up again, but found nothing. No one had admitted him. There was no proof, as if he had never existed. "That's how they treat the invisible," said Miguel. "But you're not anymore." Eduardo gathered everything he could. Photos of the place where he lived, testimonies from Marta, anonymous statements from other boys who had gone through similar networks. Even his own testimony, recorded on video with a halting but firm voice. Sometimes he broke during interviews. Other times he spoke as if telling someone else's story. The psychologist said it was normal, that his mind still didn't completely distinguish between past and present. "You're still waiting for someone to hit you when you speak," she told him once. "But here, no one's going to do that." And little by little, Eduardo began to believe it. The legal process continued its course, but so did his life. At the shelter, he began to collaborate with the migrant support team. He translated documents, taught others to fill out forms, organized food drives, and even helped set up a small library with donated books. They gave him a temporary ID as a volunteer. When he received it, he looked at it like a trophy. It wasn't a passport or a visa or a license, but it had his name, his photo, his clean face, Eduardo Ramirez Jimenez. "You're more than a number," Marta told him when she saw him with his badge hanging around his neck. "Much more." One day, while organizing papers in a common room, he found a young woman crying silently, sitting by the window. Her name was Diana. She was 17 and had arrived from Honduras after being deceived with a promise similar to his. Eduardo sat next to her, didn't ask anything, just told her, "I was there too." She looked at him, just that, and in that gesture, they understood each other without more words. From then on, Eduardo became, without wanting to, a reference point within the shelter, not through authority, not through experience, but because he spoke from a place few knew, the bottom of the pit, and because he demonstrated it was possible to get out. But advances didn't erase fear. Every time the phone rang, every time a letter arrived from USCIS, Eduardo felt a hard hit in his chest. He knew everything could change with a single decision. One afternoon, Marta arrived at the shelter with an envelope in her hand. It was white, with an official seal. Eduardo saw it from afar, and his body tensed. He walked toward her slowly, as if advancing in slow motion. "It's just a notification." "It's not the final answer," Marta told him, trying to calm him. He took the envelope, opened it with clumsy fingers and read, "Your case has been received and is under evaluation. It may take up to 18 months. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was purgatory. "What if they deny it?" he asked in a low voice. "Then we appeal. But we're not giving up," said Teresa, who was already next to them. "I promise you." That night, Eduardo went out to the shelter's patio. The sky was clear. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't raining. He sat under a tree and took out his notebook. He wrote something that had been circling his mind. "I didn't come to this country to flee. I came to resist. And resisting isn't enduring in silence. It's speaking, it's seeking justice, it's healing." They were simple words, but they belonged to him. A week later, he received an invitation to speak at a talk organized by the NGO. It was a small event, with volunteers, social workers, some donors. Eduardo hesitated. He didn't feel ready. He still stuttered when remembering certain things, but Miguel insisted, "You don't have to tell everything, just what you want, but your voice can be a door for others." He went up to the small stage with sweaty hands. In front of him, 20 people looked at him in silence. Eduardo took a deep breath. Then he began. He told his story, without embellishments, without exaggerations, with truth. He said how he had left Chiapas, believing he was going toward a better life, and how he ended up locked up, fearing for his life. He spoke of Marta, of his rosary, of the call in the rain, of the legal battle, of the wait. "I didn't want justice at first," he said, looking at the audience. "I just wanted to live. But now I understand I deserve both things." When he finished, the room filled with applause. Some were crying. Marta hugged him as if he were her own son. And that night, Eduardo knew that although his case was still pending, he had already won something no one could take away. He had stopped being invisible. Eduardo looked at himself in the mirror every morning, as if trying to verify he was real, that he was there, that he no longer slept on the floor, nor hid from sirens, nor lowered his gaze when someone spoke to him. There was something new in his eyes. It wasn't arrogance, it was firmness. After everything lived, discovering himself alive, whole, with voice and purpose, was a form of victory. The legal process continued forward. Government letters no longer paralyzed him. Teresa kept him informed of each step, each document sent, each confirmation. There was still no definitive answer, but there was progress, and that was enough to continue. In parallel, Eduardo began to work part-time as an assistant at the same NGO that had rescued him. He helped with translations, received new migrants, prepared packages with hygiene items, food, blankets. Sometimes he simply sat to listen because he knew what no one else knew, how it feels to be treated like nobody. "You have a gift, you know?" Marta told him one afternoon while watching him converse with a recently arrived Guatemalan youth. "Not everyone can speak from the wound without hurting others." Eduardo smiled. He kept those words like someone who keeps a saving bill at the bottom of their pocket. The shelter had a small room with a mural where each resident could write a sentence, a thought, something that had marked them. Many wrote simple things. "Thank you, God save me, I'll never go back." Eduardo, after several days of not deciding, wrote something with a black marker. "It's not the language that makes me an immigrant. It's the pain that taught me to fight." That phrase began to resonate. Some copied it in their notebooks. Others repeated it in low voices. It was simple, but it contained a deep truth. No one leaves their land for pleasure. No one crosses a desert for adventure. No one lets themselves be exploited for fun. They do it because there's no other option. And when they survive, what remains isn't just fear, it's courage. Eduardo also resumed a habit he had forgotten, writing. He did it at night, when the shelter became quiet. He had a new notebook, a gift from Teresa, where he wrote fragments of his story. He thought perhaps someday to turn it into a book, not to sell it, not to become famous, but so others would know, so those who were out there, trapped like he had been, would understand it was possible to get out. On one of those days, he received an unexpected visit. It was a journalist from a local outlet, a young man who covered immigration stories and had heard about him through the NGO. "I don't want to expose your case. I don't want to use your story," he told him honestly. "I just want to help you tell it, if you decide." Eduardo hesitated, not from fear, but out of respect for his past. He didn't want to be a pity story. He wanted to be an example of struggle. He accepted with one condition, that others would also be discussed. Those who still hadn't gotten out, those who remained trapped. The article was published a week later. It had the title, "From Confinement to Hope, the Voice of an Invisible Immigrant Who Decided to Speak." It included his story, photos of his work at the NGO, an interview with Marta, and another with Teresa. It didn't reveal his full last name or exact location, but it did show his face. Eduardo, when he saw it, felt a mix of fear and pride. It was him, finally, without hiding. His mother in Chiapas saw the report from a cybercafe in town. A neighbor had taken her. When she read it, she cried. She cried like she hadn't since she watched him leave. She wrote him a letter filled with pride, telling him his father would be happy to see what kind of man he had become. "You left looking for work, son, and found your voice." That's what she wrote. Eduardo kept that phrase in his heart like an anthem. Soon after, he began studying English in the afternoons, not because he felt he needed it to fit in, but because he wanted to better understand those he helped. He also started attending free GED preparation classes, the exam equivalent to high school in the United States. He dreamed someday of entering university. In one of those classes, he met a teacher of Puerto Rican descent who dedicated himself to teaching English to adult migrants. The man, upon learning his story, offered him an opportunity. "You could help me with the new Latino students. You're a bridge, Eduardo. What you lived through can be guidance for many." And that's how, without planning it, Eduardo became a reference, not for having done something extraordinary, but for having gotten up after being destroyed, for having found strength in the most unexpected place, his own pain. Every day, when leaving the shelter, he carried his mother's rosary in his pocket. Sometimes he'd take it out, squeeze it between his fingers, and think about everything that had happened. Not as a shadow, but as a root. Because he understood that his story didn't begin with confinement, not even with his departure from Chiapas. It began every time he helped someone not feel alone. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. It was in the shelter's mailbox, inside an official envelope with the seal of the United States Department of Homeland Security. Eduardo held it in his hands like fire. He looked at it for minutes. He didn't open it immediately. He held it against his chest, breathed deeply, and walked slowly to the community dining room where Marta, Teresa, and Miguel were. "It came," he said, in a low voice. Marta immediately stood up. Teresa put her cell phone aside. Miguel, without saying a word, offered him a chair. Eduardo sat down. He tore open the envelope with trembling hands. He took out the document. His eyes read the first lines, and then he read it again, 1, 2, 3 times. He didn't speak, but his face said everything. "What does it say?" Teresa asked cautiously, though she already suspected. Eduardo raised his gaze. His eyes filled with tears. He couldn't speak. He just extended the paper. Marta took it and read aloud, "Approval of T-visa application. The applicant has demonstrated being a victim of human trafficking and is granted temporary legal status in the United States." Her voice broke before reaching the end. Absolute silence for a few seconds. And then, Explosion in applause, hugs, tears. Eduardo didn't cry from sadness. He cried from relief, from pride, from justice. Because finally someone had said on official paper what he had known for so long. He wasn't guilty of fleeing hunger. He wasn't guilty of trusting. He wasn't illegal. He was a victim. And now a survivor. After the celebration, he locked himself in his room. Not to hide, but to be alone with his thought. He took out his mother's rosary and held it in his hands as always. He looked at it and smiled. "We did it, Mom," he whispered. "We did it." News spread quickly within the NGO. Everyone congratulated him. Some new residents looked at him with hope, because his victory wasn't just his. It was a sign that yes, it was possible, that even from the darkest bottom, a path toward light could be born. A week later, Eduardo asked to speak with Marta alone. They met in a quiet park under the shade of a large oak. He carried a notebook in his hand. "I want to tell you something," he said. He explained he had made a decision. He wouldn't return to Mexico, at least not for now. Not because he didn't want to see his mother. That hurt him every day, but because he understood his place, at least for the moment, was there. In Houston, where he could serve, where he could build something. "I want to study law, Marta," he told her, with a conviction he had never felt before. "I want to be an immigration lawyer. I want to defend those who have no voice, like you defended me." Marta didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him. Her eyes, normally firm, moistened. "You don't know what it means to hear you say that, Eduardo. You don't know how proud I am." The process to access university would be long. He would have to validate studies, take exams, get scholarships. But he was ready, because now, for the first time, he had a foundation, an identity, a place from which to build his life. With his temporary legal status, he could work, study, and move freely through the country. He had protection. And also a new goal. Obtaining permanent residence, something possible after some years with the T visa. It wasn't immediate, but it was achievable. And Eduardo already knew what it was like to wait with his heart in his hand. Months passed. He started an introductory course at a community college. In the afternoons, he continued working at the NGO, helping new migrants, organizing workshops, doing translations. His story became a tool, a way to open doors. One day, he received a different envelope. It wasn't official. It came with Mexican postal stamps. It was a letter from his mother. Inside came a photograph, her, in front of the house in Chiapas, holding her father's violin. "We're waiting for you, son. There's no rush. Just promise me that when you come back, it's with your head held high." That's what she wrote. And Eduardo, with eyes full of emotion, promised. Weeks later, at a university event, they asked him to share a few words in front of other migrant students. He went up to the podium without papers in hand. He no longer needed notes. "I thought my voice was broken, that it was no longer useful, that they had taken it from me. But I learned that when you decide to speak, even if trembling, you recover your soul. My story isn't one of success, it's one of resistance. They took my documents, they took my freedom, they took my right to dream. But they couldn't take the most important thing, dignity." That day, when he came down from the stage, he was given a standing ovation. He wasn't a star, he wasn't a hero. He was a young man from Chiapas who, after being locked up as a slave, had found the strength to speak, to heal, to live. And as he walked among the people, with his back straight, face serene, and his mother's rosary in his pocket, Eduardo became what he had always wanted to be, a free man. And if you liked this story, you'll surely love the next one that appears on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and turn on notifications. Until next time.